Thanks so much for joining us, Tope. It's good to see you.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
I figured we'd start the conversation off with the broadest possible question, which would be, what is autofiction? To you, to Teresa, in the general context.
I'm happy to leap in. Yeah, it's just such a big question, and I think I wrote about this a couple months ago, and I think it's a genre, if we'll call it that, that's still kind of being, I suppose, created. I guess there's a kind of tacit agreement about what it is. And that's when I started writing, what I was a bit frustrated about, because I wasn't quite sure, who had decided what it was and who was like adjudicating it. Not to, any artistic category is ever kind of formally created and kind of disseminated, if you will. But a long way of saying that, 10 years ago, I guess back in 2010, I read Reality Hunger by David Childs. Mm-hmm. I was really deeply impacted by it. I read it like 3 or 4 times when it came out. I agreed with much of what was in it. I loved the way it was constructed, the fact that he had taken bits and pieces of all kinds of things and made this coherent sort of piece of, I guess we'll call it, literature. And I really liked that about it. And much of what he was talking about as well really appealed to me. The notion that he was sort of sick of fiction, if you will, that was something that resonated profoundly with me. He integrated this idea that reality TV was an important part of this kind of new thing that was emerging. And as somebody who, I like all kinds of stuff, but I'm definitely an adherent. I definitely watch more than my fair share of reality TV. And 2, he was talking about this idea that we needed to kind of reach beyond this kind of false construction of things. And all of that stuff deeply impacted me and resonated with me. So I started to write fiction somewhat under the influence of that idea. I was also reading a lot of Paul Auster at the time, and he's somebody who definitely seems to dance on that line between fiction and nonfiction. And I was also obsessed at that point with The Counter Life by Philip Roth, and that's a novel I've read more than, sort of, I'm ashamed to say I've read a lot. So like all of these influences were kind of floating around. And so I started my engagement with autofiction, if you will, based on my engagement with those works of art. And in addition to the work of Abbas Kiarostami, who's one of my favorite filmmakers of all time, and the work that he does in Certified Copy and Close Up in particular. So yeah, I kind of, based on all of these influences, I thought, well, maybe I can strike out and begin to do something similar, because that's where my muse, if you will, is taking me.
Yeah. And Teresa, I wonder what your approach is and your thinking.
Yes. So I agree that it's this question of like, what is autofiction is sort of, I would say, actually part of the definition of autofiction in some way. Like it's purporting to be something that is experimenting beyond what a solid definition can be, and including with the form. And I think, so I actually started as a nonfiction writer. So I began writing memoir and, nonfiction. And I thought I didn't have an imagination, which is why I had to write a nonfiction, right? Because I would be inspired by the events that I had experienced as I remembered them. And so I, over time though, as I was continuing to work, I started to realize that I was writing fiction, in that I was trying to get to a truth that was outside of the actual facts, and that it felt in some ways more ethical, and more integral to call it fiction. And so fast forward, eventually when I landed in a PhD program for English and creative writing, I decided to actually study this issue as closely as I could for one of my comp lists. So I actually looked at what is autofiction? What is what are autobiographical novels? What's a roman à clef? What's the difference between these things? You
have the answers.
No, I mean,
you come bearing the truth.
What's interesting is that it's like you see that there's that really what is autofiction is it's a discourse that's always emerging, right? Yeah, and that the things that get called autofiction in the larger field, especially by the critical class, are often, as you point out in your New Republic article, which I was so excited when I saw that. It's like there's a certain kind of whiteness. And I say a certain kind because it's often a kind of whiteness that's legible a kind of class that's legible to the critics and the sort of literary class, that they can see their experience reflected in it,
Yeah.
you know? But, you know, I think that, you know, so of course there's Serge Dubrowski, who coined the term, you know, the French guy, you know, the very experimental novel. And again, in his initial definition, there's this idea of an experiment in language, right?
Yeah.
And then there's the whole way where autobiographical content, especially by women or femmes or queer folks, or writers of color, has often been, you know, dismissed or like minimized. And actually, to go back to, you know, how I started talking about this idea that I didn't have an imagination, that's actually the criticism that, you know, would be you know, sort of like hurled at folks who were drawing on their personal experience if they weren't a white male, like a, you know, that it wasn't imaginative, they weren't imaginative enough. So what I like about the term is that, you know, it's acknowledging, it's sort of claiming this thing that we can draw on our lived experiences, that we all do. And also we're making art, right? Making, and I also like the point that you make in your article about part of what the stakes are in terms of who we're claiming to sort of fall under that umbrella, is that it is considered this, like, you know, sort of form or genre that's pushing the novel forward. And so who gets to be sort of, you know, at the, you know, in that group, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's such a great explanation. And as I sit here, it's sort of like, it's almost like this really exclusive club. And, you know, there's some like burly gentleman who's like, you know, no, you can't get in. And he's like waving all these other people. And you're like, why are they getting in? Why can't I get in? And like, you don't know what's inside necessarily, but you know that something exciting is happening inside and you want to join the party. And so that's the feeling I had. And part of the inspiration for the piece was, the idea that I'm reading a lot of criticism, and just because it's something I'm interested in doing. And I was just struck by the fact that autofiction seemed to cover like the experience of living an urban life, specifically like in New York, and doing a specific set of things. And if you were writing from an explicitly autobiographical place, you know, that's fine. But as long as you're going to enough art museums and, you know, musing about your sex life and or lack thereof or whatever else, and doing a certain set of things, then it's autofiction. But if you're living, sort of
exactly, right, having this
exactly, this ironic distance from, you know, your feelings or life or whatever.
And like you're aware that you have that ironic distance as well.
And you comment on it, and you have one vulnerable point in the book where you see the stars and they're shining through you or something, but then you step back and it's back. You know?
Exactly.
There are certain tropes associated with the kinds of autofiction that was being, you know, recognized and celebrated. I still think about that James Wood, his review of Lerner's first book, where some people kind of see this as sort of maybe the first, I guess, recognition that something was happening. I'm not sure if
at least in English. Yeah,
exactly. No, precisely. In English. Yeah.
In the States. I should say.
In the States. Let's be super specific. In the United States of America.
In the United States. In the United States English.
That's exactly it. And its review I've read a bunch of times. And what you see there kind of is one person saying to another person, like, and that's fiction, right? Like, that's something we have to recognize. One person saying to another, I recognize what you're doing. There's this part of it that I personally relate to. And that's why I think it's important, right? And that's why I think that people should read this book. But when you're writing this in the pages of the New Yorker magazine, like, it suddenly becomes a thing. It's not just like one person relating to another. It has the stamp of approval of the institution, you know, this really important institution saying that, hey, this is an important work of art. And all of a sudden the conversation begins to build around it. Like, so if you have somebody who's from some rural part of America, Appalachia, you know, they're probably not going to get access to that kind of, you know, megaphone, right? Or, you know, a person of color or, you know, a woman, you're likely not going to get access to that. And that's really troubling to me. And I say this as somebody, I was born and raised in the States, but a lot of my work has been inspired by spending time in Africa. And I've had the great pleasure, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, there's this organization called the Caine Prize for African Writing. I was fortunate enough to win the Caine Prize back in 2013. And back in I guess it was 2017, they invited like a bunch of maybe 10 of us, they like the best, quote unquote, and this is always a problematic way of framing things, but the best, sort of writers in our generation. We were all in a room together and we were just talking in really sort of heated and deep, passionate ways about literature. And I was, and I have been deeply inspired by some of the conversations I've had with those in that room and subsequent to that meeting. And I think it's a tragedy that there isn't kind of, the same kind of, we don't have the possibility of having the same kind of amplifying effect. If one of us does something interesting and it's great, then it goes off into the world, or we do, but it's all framed in a very particular way, right? So some of the people in that room were like, Novala Bulawayo, who was shortlisted for the Booker a few years ago, Namwali Serpel, who's had a great run last year. I was there, a guy named El Nathan John, who's been doing really interesting work from Nigeria. Just like really inspiring, interesting people and people who care deeply about literature and do nothing but read all day. We're all a bunch of nerds as well. And I was thinking, like, it'd be cool if there was some way of talking about or capturing what's happening here as well, right? Not just, I live in New York and my friend says that this guy's doing interesting work, so I'm going to read this work. And even though like a small press issue did, like I think it's the bomb, so I'm going to read it. Like that's a really specific thing that's happening. And I think it's unfortunate that that's not a broader thing that's happening, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I know it totally does. It's that question of like, how do you decentralize the platforms?
Yeah.
Right. Like, so that it's actually like, there's more horizontal and you actually can hear more of what's happening, That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And with like the James Wood essay and how the criticism around autofiction has developed is kind of an example of how whiteness is like baked into the whole establishment, because you see when you have a majority of white critics, reading various kinds of work, they have, I guess, like limited frame of reference, maybe a poverty of the diversity of reading in their background, so that, when they see a book by a non-white immigrant or an immigrant narrative from a non-white writer, they're like, this can't be autofiction. This falls neatly into the immigrant narrative category. And so it's just like, it's an almost like a disability, like to actually.
It is. Yeah. It's a great way of putting it. Yeah. That's a perfect way of putting it. And they're just like, I don't think we acknowledge enough the extent to which like literature is about relationships, right? Like part of the reason why that New Yorker essay happens is, let's be honest, somebody passed, James Wood is like, he's enmeshed in this kind of web of, a particular kind of literature, right? And so somebody passed him the novel, somebody's talking about it, he's on a subway with someone, he's in class with somebody, and the book comes to him that way. And that's often how it works, right? So if it's not connected to his specific circumstance, he's probably not going to sit down and read it and spend the time it takes to write up this essay about it, right? And so there are a bunch of people who don't benefit from that because they're not part of those networks.
Right.
And it assumes that only great literature is happening here because, somebody passed them this book and they're raving about it. And at some dinner party somewhere, they couldn't stop talking about it. So this is the center of literature. And it just so happens he has this massive platform and a lot of people read him and they care about what he says. And so if he says, this is important, it becomes important, right? So I just think that kind of, it limits the potential of what we could do with literature this century because the conversations are just so darn limited,
Yeah. I had made this random connection after reading your New Republic essay by I revisited an essay unrelated to this by another Wood, Robin Wood. He's like a horror film critic and a film critic.
Okay.
And he has this essay called like A Brief History of the American Horror Film. And he creates this formula basically for what makes an American horror film, which is it's oversimplified, but like, it's normality threatened by the monster. And normality is represented by heterosexual patriarchal capitalism. He leaves out white supremacists, but despite using a couple of examples, but you can throw that in there too. And in thinking about like, if that's your framework, like where does that leave room for, if non-white people, if non-straight people are only being processed through the lens of the monster, how does that leave room for a non-white protagonist, right? So it's this incredible limiting frame that essentially erases the audience's expectations when it's repeated enough for like any kind of broadening of a genre, right? So like you can't fit. The first thing that came to mind is like Get Out. Like you can't fit that into that formula. It's not a thing at all.
Yeah.
And so it seems to be like a similar thing going on in American literary criticism, at least, with like these blinders that don't allow for any kind of broader sort of vision or even like interpretation.
Yeah. The last thing I'd say about this is that, you got me up. I would say that, I guess the primary criterion for a writer, if you're not like a white male writer, becomes accessibility. And I wrote about this somewhere as well, like the extent to which your work is accessible. And if your work isn't accessible, then what about your work is accessible? Because that's the part that we'll talk about and will be broadcast around. And so because of that, it limits the work itself, or it's seen through a kind of scrim. Like, okay, I'm reading this book. This is about the other, in all caps. I don't get what's happening here. What can I translate from this experience to my experience so that people who aren't from here will access it, instead of saying, take the book on its own terms. It's in the same way that we kind of treat human beings, right? Like when people of color talk, for example, about code switching, that's making yourself accessible to this norm that's been established over time. And so the parts of yourself that don't conform to that norm, you kind of cleave off and walk, go to work or wherever, and you make yourself accessible to people so that you can have this, sustainable life. Otherwise, you won't. And the same thing is happening with literature. And I think it's a shame that the primary criterion for whether a book is accessible or not is accessibility, right? Like it's interesting, for example, if we leap to another art form, that after the murder of George Floyd, a few months ago, like the top film on Netflix was The Help, right? Like, and that's because it's an accessible narrative. And some of the books that did well also were kind of about accessibility, even if the books were more I guess, complicated and interesting than was discussed. The primary way that they were discussed was through this prism of accessibility. Like, okay, if you want to understand the Black condition, read this book. If you want to understand slavery or passing, right? Like, understand this book and how these things impact people of color today, as opposed to let me take a book on its own and come to the book, as opposed to the book needing to come to me. So it's something I've been thinking about a lot as well.
No, I read that essay. It was in the LA Review of Books, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's such a great essay. And, I often, like, I was reflecting on it and thinking about how I often use the word legibility, like where you're talking about accessibility, I'll talk about legibility. It's like, what is actually legible? And I was thinking about, what you were saying about acknowledging how much that literature is actually about relationships, right? And that, in some ways I see books as being sort of like these manifestations of these relationships, these conversations that have been going on, that you can actually, part of the thing that's so cool about being a writer is you can have a deep conversation with the dead, right?
Yeah,
I mean, you can do that outside of books too, I'll just say, but you can also do that in books. But I also think that the question of taking the book on its own terms, as opposed to having, I'm just going to share this experience I had actually with your book, which is, so I'm thinking about the way that's like actually the cultural problem, and especially I think a cultural problem of white folks, right? And I'm counting myself in there, of actually having this like constricted heart, right? Like the thing of not being able to, like being so focused on striving and not being open to more, and having a lot of unhealed wounds.
Yeah.
And, so when I read your book last year was the first time that I read it. And I just reread it for, preparing for this conversation. And one of the things that happened in between reading it the first time and reading it the second time was that my book came out. But more importantly, I had an older sister and my mom. both read my book. And, my family, super religious. I'm queer, it's been very estranged for many, many years. And it's only been more recently that we've started to be more in touch. But I actually, in just this week, my mom actually called me and said she was sorry. It's like profound experience, right? Of having, and she was reading, that was not at all what I expected her to think reading I wasn't expecting that at all. But what I noticed rereading your book then was that the place at the end of the book where Tunde has traveled and the family is there, and there's this belonging it's even though it's strange, but there's also the sense of belonging. I was just able to actually take that in, and I was weeping in a completely different way than the first time I read it. And I don't know. Maybe that's too vulnerable to share, but I think that there's something about how I keep coming back, and Ryan will know this because he knows me, but it's how do we do the inside work so that we actually can see and perceive other people more truly, right?
Yeah. That's such a profound point. First of all, thank you so much for your words. And it means a lot to me. And I would say that you say something that's really important, because so many people talk about books as like machines of empathy. And the assumption is that you just kind of, traipse in any bookstore, pick up a book and read it. And you're saying something that I think is really important, which is that you do have to come to the book as well, right? Like you have to do the work of trying to get a sense of what this book is about, the characters that inhabit the book, why they're meaningful, why they're important. Because the thing is that people who exist outside the kind of white male experience do this anyway. Like we have been conditioned to feel empathy for white male protagonists our entire life, right? Not only that, to kind of want to be white male protagonists our entire life. So we don't have to do the work of imagining this person who's falling out of love and how painful that might be, or do the work of just wanting to have ambition and having that ambition stymied or for some reason. We know what that is, but then it's difficult sometimes, I think, for people, for certain white people. And I'm not the kind of person, I recognize we're all human beings and we kind of grow up in systems and they affect us. And I'm really sensitive to that. I get that. So I'm not trying to bash anyone, but I do think that it's sometimes difficult for people who have grown up in the seat of power, if you will, to kind of descend from the throne a little bit and get a sense of what it might be for other people. And that act of descending is deeply important if you want to access the work, I think, Absolutely. And I think that and especially when you're sitting, I was thinking, I don't have a cogent thought about this yet, but I was thinking about the very word of author, like authority, and actually giving up authority as an author to do the thing to reflect on the fact that your embodied experience is also a racinated experience. Is also a gender, all of those things. Right. I remember in school, in a writing workshop in my PhD program, saying something like, well, of course, we're all thinking about this with our characters because all of our characters have bodies, and bodies we all know are, have different experiences in the world based on how they're perceived by others. Right. Yeah.
And just the weird silence. but
I think something that your words are reminding me of and making me think about in terms of accessibility and how we approach books is accessibility is also, and how we perceive it, in the publishing industry is very much also about the reader, right? Accessible to whom? Accessible to the reader. And so, that centers white readers. And so when you have something like, the uprisings in June and to this present day and forever, but when you have a moment like that, a flashpoint, and these books come out, the white reader, I think, if I may speak for all white readers, generally my perception and observation is that, the white reader will turn to authors of color, almost to not to learn more, but to say how do I fix it, right? So to learn more, but to think of it as a more surface level kind of solution, right? Like, what's the answer? Tell me the answer. When really it's more about fixing yourself and fixing yourself in a way that will allow you to actually read a novel more openly and like open your heart, kind of like Teresa's talking about.
Yeah. Well, it becomes homework is what it becomes, right?
Yeah.
It becomes like, here's your homework. There's a difference between like doing your homework and then doing the work or engaging with art just because you want to engage with art. Like, these are very different experiences. So if something horrible happens in the world, you're like, gosh, I feel bad about it. Let me do my homework about this. And somebody says, oh, here's this great book by this Black writer. You're like, okay, I'll read it and I'll do the work. And then I'll do my book club thing. And then I'll go back to doing the stuff that I actually want to do. Right. And the question is, how do you begin to engage with, work that's outside the white experience in those more intimate ways, right? Like, how do we get there? Because I think that's when something exciting begins to happen. I don't know if both of you had the chance to read that Vulture piece about American Dirt that I think came out like a month ago. Like, it was a really interesting article, right? About like how this book that, had this, there was this crazy conversation about it, I guess it was last year before the pandemic hit. When life was so different. But like, it's interesting to kind of see the evolution of that, like how this writer who claimed one identity began to claim this other identity for the purpose of the book. And then how booksellers, who are incredibly important, a part of this process, like they started to like the book, how the publishing house decided that it was going to be a hit, right? Like, and that's incredibly important too, because they can move books. And if they put all their marketing behind this book, then it's going to become this thing. And so how this thing happens, and it purports to speak to a particular experience, but then people who actually emerge from that experience say, no, this is not it at all. Right? This is not, and we were consulted, nobody asked us, and it becomes this. And so I think it's like a perfect summation, and if you will, of how this often happens, and something that we have to think more deeply about.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about autofiction in relation to both of your books, and because you both consider them autofiction. And so maybe you touched on it a little bit already, but in the writing process itself, at what point in the process were you like, were you conscious of writing autofiction? Did it come naturally, or did you kind of find your way to it as you were writing in the drafting process? How did that material and approach reveal itself to you?
I think for me, I was, I didn't know. I have to say that the other thing with me is that I don't have an MFA. I don't have like sort of academic, sort of fiction training, whatever we'll call it. And so I was nervous, and I love literature so much. And I was nervous about like saying, I'm going to write a book of fiction. So I started thinking I was writing a memoir, and that's what I did. 2010, I was sitting down, I thought I'll write something about my life. And I started, and I noticed that the book was going in different directions, that stuff that happened to me wasn't necessarily happening to the character and vice versa. And I noticed too that I was more taken with questions of craft, like, okay, like how do I get this character in and out of a room, but how do I make this chapter work? How do I make, this section of the book work? And I was less focused on how do I render my life on the page. And so as that continued, it came to me that I was actually working on a piece of fiction. And maybe fiction itself is kind of a misnomer, because I think that's what trips a lot of people up. They're like, oh, it has to be like fake. It has to be, sort of contrived or taken wholesale from your imagination. And that's not what happened with me at all. Like, yes, it is based in a real way in my life, but I also wanted it to work as a story on its own terms. And I also wanted to do something that I hadn't necessarily seen in literature, which is like, create a character who, for a moment, like inhabits two realities, and not sort of say it's he's going crazy or it's not some kind of accident of something, but like that here's a person who is trying to reconcile in a real way what it means to inhabit two different realities, and how this person arrives at a solution to this quandary that he has, right? And so it came to me that like I could do this within perhaps an autofictional framework easier than I can do it in some other framework. But that's how I started the book.
Yeah, I love that. I love where his grandma is like, why don't you, listen to these messages when he starts having the double memories. It's like, maybe there's something there, this kind of, I love that. So
thank you.
What I like about it too is that the book starts off pretty straightforward in terms of, this is like a work of realism, and it's compelling, like great craft-wise, it's like on point, it's engaging. And then it does a thing that I really love in books, which I call like the psycho twist, which in Psycho, the main character
Yeah.
dies in the middle and something changes.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden you're like caught in this, like right in the center. I think White Tears sort of does it too. You descend. In White Tears, you're like descending into a nightmare. But like, so in this book, halfway through, more or less, all of a sudden, the narrator starts speaking in the third person. You're like, what's going on? The double memories are revealed. And then all of a sudden, everything that happened before becomes recontextualized, and you have to like deal with that. And I love being surprised like that. So I don't know, that was something that really struck me. And I did have a question related to that actually, which I can ask, which is like, how did you conceive of that, like generically speaking? Because once that happened, once the double memories happen, and we get the reader isn't really given a sense of what's real and what isn't. To me, there was very much like a fantastical vibe to that, a fantastical influence, and maybe triggered by the fact that within the story, Tunde is like a sci-fi fan. So like, do you conceive of this as, whether it matters or not, I don't know, but did you think of this as a work of realism where there are fantastical influences pushing you in that direction?
Yeah, it's a great question. I am obsessed with sci-fi. I love it. If you check out my Netflix queue, I'm just like watching lots of sci-fi. When I was growing up, I read mostly sci-fi and fantasy. That's all I read until I was like 22. So that stuff is really important to me. And I think it influences the way I see the world and think about literature as well. So that was part of it. And two, I mentioned before, Abbas Kiarostami, who's a filmmaker I return to a lot, and the Iranians in general, right? Like, I think they're just such fantastic filmmakers. I think in my mind, like the Romanians and the Iranians are, like they're vying for supremacy of like sort of film. And so I engage a lot with their films and think about what they're doing. And I just like the fact that they just kind of deal with reality differently. And I think part of it comes from the fact that, and hopefully at some point we take up this conversation if we have time here, Teresa, about like sort of Christianity. But my dad is a major Christian. Like, I think he might be like number one Christian in the world. If there's a competition, I think he's at the top of the list. Oh, really? Okay, well, they should have a face-off of some kind. Okay. And but it's kind of, there's this other influence as well, though, because my dad is from Nigeria and he was born and raised there. And so he has a completely different understanding of reality than I do. Like, when he was growing up, it was, he understands, he believes, I believes even is not maybe quite the right word, because that implies like he's having to surmount something. Like for him, no, he knows is a better way of putting it, better verb there. He knows that there are other spiritual influences that play an active role in our everyday lives that are like here with us, that are either directing or observing us. And I grew up in a space where my dad would talk about that. He would say like, be cognizant of the angels that are like watching you as you do this. Be cognizant of your ancestors, right? Like, be cognizant that they're here with us. And at the same time, he would say, like, do well in school, master that test, And so like, I grew up in a space where I was supposed to accept that there were all these spiritual influences that were not influences, but they were like manifestly impacting my life in a real way. And at the same time, I have to accept like, logic and grow up and master those things in school as well. And so I think I wanted to just kind of like throw these things together in my book. And I wanted to find a way to capture that. So, and to not say, like, okay, explain it away and say, okay, here's a figment of his imagination, or this is his belief system, but to say these two things are possible and these two things exist. There's a chapter in my book where it's flitting back and forth between first person, past and present tense. And it's that chapter where after the conversation with his grandmother, that Tunde is trying to integrate these two realities. He's trying to say, okay, like the only possible way to do this is to like integrate these both realities. And at the end of that chapter, he says, I can't do it. It's like, it's not working. But then the turn into third person is when he's trying to distance himself from it, to say, well, this character, it has to exist in fiction, I, me. And he's trying to do what most people in the West would do, like to say, like, I'm going to distance myself from this psychotic thing that's happening to me. But then at a certain point in that third person narration, the I steps through when he meets the woman for the first time. He says, I see her I look at her, or whatever he says. I should know, it's my book, but I said, I look at her. And then it goes back into third person.
Yep.
And then the next chapter, and this is something I went back and forth with my publisher about. I was reading a lot of Frantz Fanon at the time and W.E.B. Du Bois. And I was thinking about like, I was thinking about the middle passage as this kind of like spiritual space, and what would it mean to kind of go back, to go back as opposed to coming here to go back. And so I asked my publisher to strip away, typically at the top of books, they have the name of the book and the name of the author. And I said, could you strip all that away for this kind of middle passage section of my book? Just because it's shorn of context. It's just a lot of dialogue. And it's him trying to figure himself out as he interacts with Noelle, his girlfriend, who isn't named until he references a lyric from Lauryn Hill. Now the joy of my world is in Zion, is in Noelle, he says, right? And Lauryn Hill's name is Lauryn Noelle Hill. And he is, throughout the book, expressed this kind of obsession with Lauryn Hill. So the possibility exists that this is all happening in his imagination or some weird realm, or the possibility exists that Noelle is a real person that he's met. And so I just wanted to kind of create this space where he could flip back and forth between realities, and I'm not apologizing or constructing some logical scenario for why this is happening. So,
And I would say, I had like not consciously noticed that, but now I'm looking at those pages, and that's beautiful. And also I would say like that, if I was writing a paper on this, I'd be like, this is one of the reasons that this is autofiction too, because it's that play with the actual materiality of the object, right? Playing with the paratextual aspects.
Ooh, I like it. I'm serious. I like that. I should have been an academic at some other part of my life. I would get far too excited when.
So Tope, I too was, just the spirit world was not. It was just what it was just as real. It just and so it's like. But there wasn't, so it's interesting. It's, so in my book, there's a lot of interesting sort of parallels in terms of multiple perspectives. There's first, there's third, there's also, it's like polyphonic. So there's like her in different voices, right? Like her 13, her 17-year-old self, her 8-year-old self. And then as an adult,
my stuff. Yeah,
as an adult too.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that when you were talking about, he tries, like Tunde tries to like step back. I can't reconcile these two things, and so he tries to step back. And the phrase that came into my head was, "Oh, it's that kind of like ethnographic turn." Right. Almost like trying to look at, which is, again, my narrator sort of like becomes, it is like obsessed with anthropology and sort of, like, and looking at other places to make sense of the spiritual, like the animism in the spiritual world that is part of her experience, but is not part of the general culture at all, that she's also told that she's supposed to be in. Right.
That's an interesting parallel that I didn't think about until you brought it up, which is like in Teresa's book, which is atypical of the sort of ostensible coming of age religious in a stern religious upbringing kind of story, is that, rather than towards the end or in the middle, seeing this sort of backlash of growing up religious and being indoctrinated and having this angst and anger, like in Teresa's book, it's very much about later in life becoming more pluralistic and accepting some of those things as legitimate. And if you're going to accept like as the character of Marie, as she's older, goes and like studies anthropology and the beliefs of other cultures, and she's like, well, to some degree, I can't hate or blame my parents for believing this stuff. Obviously there's like more to it than that, but just the general the mindset of allowing for, like, Marie's mindset in a way is like your mindset in letting both of those realities and multiple realities sort of just exist without sort of comment or categorization, or maybe not, without like letting them coexist and overlap, I guess,
Yeah. And saying also like there's other ways of being and knowing the world rather than like white Western enlightenment.
Right.
Yeah. And that's what I'm trying to go for in my art as well. I mean, I'm loving hearing about your book because it seems that we have many of the same concerns, and it's heartening that, you know, we're other people are, that I'm not just kind of stuck in my head doing strange things, that there seems to be some other, you know, people who kind of feel the same way, because I'm convinced that, you know, I've been thinking a lot about this meta-modernism. I'm not sure if you guys have read or heard about it, but like there's this kind of emerging theory, you know, that, you know, we had, you know, modernism, and then, you know, which is all about at the beginning of the 20th century, excited about what's going on, excited about like all the technological progress we're making that seems to align with Einstein, you know, sort of making these incredible discoveries and coming up with these incredible ideas about science, and there's all kinds of stuff happening. And then postmodernism, which in many ways is a kind of response to World War II, and there's, you know, and it's more kind of about dialectics and irony and all kinds of stuff. And then metamodernism, which kind of posits that a kind of both and framework, that it's possible that we need to have a sense of kind of excitement and discovery, but also because of what's happening to the planet, the fact that it's warming, the fact that we're not doing enough to kind of counteract that, to kind of also at the same time have a sense of understanding where we are, you know, as this human race and what we have to do to kind of surmount some of the problems we have, right? So, and I've been thinking, and that's a kind of, this kind of both and framework is not it's not the way that we think about life in the West a lot. You know, we're kind of more rigid, we're kind of binary. Either this thing is real or it isn't real, right? Mm-hmm. Either you do this or you can't do that, right? Like, and so for me, when I'm growing up, I think a lot of my angst as a younger adult, was the fact that I was being asked to reconcile the way that my parents saw the world, that my Nigerian family saw the world, and what I was learning in school, which, you know, the school said, you know, like logic is important. And I was a high school debater, which is an entirely other thing as well, right? So I was like very steeped in this culture of the importance of logic, partly as a kind of rebellion to my father, who was like, yeah, logic's important and ASAP for the school, but remember all these forces that are around you. That felt oppressive to me. So I said, no, I'm going to reject that. But then as I got older, like I found that, especially in grad school, when I had a bit of a, I suppose we call it in retrospect, a kind of quarter life crisis, but a kind of crisis. I don't know if it was a spiritual crisis, an intellectual crisis, but I thought like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what I'm supposed to believe. And part of it is what you said, Teresa, and how you were describing her book, Ryan, is that I sensed internally that a lot of the stuff that I'd grown up with was still valid, even though I'd rejected it. And I think I was having this crisis of like, thinking about how to integrate that into my life. Like what kind of person am I if I say or accept that maybe my ancestors are playing some active role in my life, that they care about me in some way? What am I rejecting all this learning that I've done? Am I rejecting the fact that I've had success in this Western framework? Like, what does that mean for me? And what is it? I just didn't know what to do. And I think in many ways, literature like provided me a pathway of reconciling and answering some of those questions that I couldn't find in any other space.
Amen. Because I mean, that's the thing. A book is always a both and too, right? Or
yeah, exactly.
You know?
Absolutely.
I love that, you know, and even how language is, you know, I love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would note that also, like, you know, both of you having books that sort of don't follow the typical, you know, in addition to maybe being easily misunderstood or misperceived by a critical establishment, you know, don't really fall into structures that the typical Western American reader would expect. And so they're also challenging in that sense. And so clearly both of you also have a strong grasp over what you're doing, over how you've crafted your art. And so I wanted to kind of veer, and this is maybe a parallel discussion about critical reception. You know, how important is it for the writer, or for you as a writer, to kind of have a strong grasp over what you're doing, the genre you're working in, you know, the craft elements, and, you know, to what extent is that sort of approach like veering off into the writer as critic? You know, like, is the writer as critic a way of maybe countering the sort of more austere, sort of set in their ways, you know, white American critical establishment, at least if we're just talking about the United States?
Yeah.
I mean, I can just speak to sort of my process, which is that I tend to figure out what I'm doing after I'm doing it. Like I often, even the book before Reconception, Maison Femme, which is about two women who have an independent press in their basement, which I and my ex-wife had an independent press in our basement in Los Angeles for many years. And it's like literally, based, I had this, kind of came up with this structure and followed this structure and wrote this book. And then afterwards, when I was researching Romana Clay's, I was like, oh, that's it. Check. It does that too. Now, that is not to say that like I was some, brilliant genius that, intuited those genres, but rather that I think that a lot of the books that I was reading, like other literature that I was reading, had those qualities. And so probably that's part of what's coming in, I think it can be useful to look at genre. I don't know. I find it deeply satisfying as a writer, and probably also like the Virgo in me to like have the after you do something and then looking at sort of genre characteristics and realizing how your work falls into that. I also think that there's a process, a space where once you have a project defined enough where you can, literary criticism can be very generative for me too, but not necessarily, directly, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I think a lot about cinema, and I was thinking about like the folks who were at Cahiers du Cinema back in sort of mid 20th century in France, people like Truffaut and Godard, and they started from a critical place, right? Like part of their argument was that the right films weren't being appreciated. So Truffaut in particular loved Hitchcock films, and Hitchcock at that point was sort of like considered a kind of B movie, sort of movie maker. And he's like, no, like he's creating incredible, viable art. And he wrote about it. And then you have these folks who start making their own films. And so I think there's something to be, or you think about the Dogma 95 movement? Lars von Trier was part of that, and they write this sort of statement about the kind of art they're going to create, and then they go out and do it. So I think there's something to be said, especially the thing that connects all these folks is that they're white men, and perhaps they have the space to do this. But I thought it would be interesting to, before I began to write, to kind of set out a space to say, well, this is what I'm going to try to do, and maybe like 3 people read it, but to say like it's coming from this thoughtful place, to say like, I want to set out this space where I can do things that I haven't seen before. Mm-hmm. And if you read my work and you're confused about certain things, perhaps you can come back to these pieces and say, well, this is what he was thinking about at the time that he composed the work. I do think that sometimes it's important to kind of create that space. It's sort of what Duchamp did as well back in the early 20th century. He had to create this kind of critical space for the kind of work he wanted to produce before he produced it, and he was rejected. Initially. A lot of his work. The funniest thing about him is that he kind of created a couple sort of competitions for artists because he was getting rejected from some of the mainstream ones, and he was rejected from their own sort of galleries and spaces that he created for himself. They thought his work was too out there for those spaces as well, which is really interesting if you think about it. But I do think it's sometimes important, especially if a lot of the critics are kind of tuned into the same dial, which is often the case, to kind of say, well, there's something happening on this radio station over here that you might not be aware of. But to kind of put that down is important, even if it's just a marker for people in the future who want to get a sense of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think like what I was thinking after reading the New Republic piece, as my brain tends to think, is like, how do we fix this? What's something that can be done? And that in a way certainly can't be done on this episode, but also like I think the essay hints at like a larger structural problem and the need for like a larger cultural change, in the sense that you can't really open up the critical dialogue. You can't really open up publishing, make it truly inclusive, and more pluralistic without actually like addressing white supremacy, and something Teresa and I talk about too is like, at the very least, and we're talking about a lot of work from white people. And what Teresa and I talk about is, examining our own subject positions within our writing and finding ways, at least, so not necessarily as critics, but as writers, to make whiteness visible in our own work. And at the very least, I've been thinking about what is the ethical responsibility of the white writer to acknowledge that, and how that relates to criticism, I suppose, is like, if white writers are doing that, then we know it's at least being seen and read and processed by white critics. And so, where does the change begin? I don't really know, in terms of trying to open up that sort of closed American critical mindset. But I also thought the reason I asked about the writer as critic is like, maybe, if you don't, if the system is messed up, like maybe there's a parallel system, maybe there's, a counter system. I don't know. This was just things going through my mind after reading the article, being like, how can we actually open things up? I don't know.
No, I mean, I think it's and that is the poets, the poets know, and I'm saying this coming from like primarily poetry community, but there would be this, especially when I was in LA, there was this sense of like, oh, if we can, get something going, like a scene going, then we can, people were very aware that they needed to make the discourse around the work in order to try to shift the conversation to make the work be legible. Right.
Yeah.
But if you go back all the way to like Harlem Renaissance, you see that as well.
Of course.
Like,
so such a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that, one of the things that's interesting is, or I think that's going to be interesting, is to see how the cultural landscape shifts with the pandemic.
Yeah.
Right. Because what we're essentially having are these decentralized events for the first time, right? Like you can attend events in New York if you want to, if they're on Zoom, but also like people are, just last night I was in a reading that was like being, sort of launched in Colorado, but the readers were in California and in Washington. And then there's people all over the country. And so it's sort of interesting to see, like, that has to have some kind of impact too.
I hope it does. Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope it does.
Yeah. Me too. Because part of it is the thing of this like, like the New York publishing having too much power. Right. Yeah. And like thinking too much of itself. And, and again, like in the poetry world, like I used to sort of joke, but that there could sometimes become this kind of New York provincialism. Like people in New York would think that the only thing that's interesting that's happening in the world is happening there. And so they actually don't know anything else that's happening in the world. And actually there's a lot of super interesting work being made. Yeah, right.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it goes back to, I think we're deluding ourselves if we don't think about the extent to which those personal relationships are just so incredibly important in terms of like building a literary career. Even if you can see this play out on social media as well, like somebody will get a galley, they might have gotten to Iowa together, or they live in Brooklyn together, and they'll say, oh gosh, this galley is so incredible. And then like 40 people say, oh, this galley, I want the galley. So the buzz begins to build, right? And everyone's plugged into that, whether you're a reviewer at Publishers Weekly or Booklist, or you are a publicist or whatever else. Like it's all kind of, you're part of the same network. And so if there's a notion that this thing is going to become a phenomenon, then like it becomes a phenomenon, like just kind of the way the world works. And so I don't think we think enough about like how that kind of community of readers and writers like impacts what we all read. Like a few people who party together in New York have decided that this is the book of the season, and so it becomes the book of the season.
Absolutely. And maybe there's something else besides like capitalistic success.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like maybe there's a different, like, I don't know. I'm just also trying, it's like, like how could we actually shift what we value?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So valuing the connections in some ways more than like the power that is afforded through, like, I don't know. It's, because of course you're going to have power. I'm sort of talking myself into little corners here, but
Yeah. Well, I think it's
I love it.
sort of feeling towards groping towards a kind of different system, right? And I think to some degree, small presses, independent publishers can play a role in that too, because as you know, Teresa was. Oh, now my dog's barking. Teresa was one, and I still am one, and just like thinking of, you know, certainly like finding the hits is not really like our top priority, and so. But I think there's more that could be done as well.
Yeah.